Since the mid-1990s, the video game industry has had one event that stood above all others. A gathering where the biggest announcements, groundbreaking technologies, and unforgettable moments were unveiled to the world. That event was the Electronic Entertainment Expo, better known as E3. First held in 1995, E3 was created as a stage for the gaming industry to showcase its latest and greatest to press, retailers, and fans alike. From console wars to legendary game reveals, it became the epicenter of gaming news, shaping the industry's future one announcement at a time. For decades, E3 wasn't just an event, it was the heartbeat of gaming, setting the tone for the year ahead. Today, we're exploring the history of E3, from its humble beginnings to its eventual end. So step onto the show floor, grab a front row seat, and join us for today's blockbuster trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello and welcome to the 246th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week, we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby video games a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, we are taking a deep dive into E3, the legendary gaming expo that became the epicenter for industry reveals and unforgettable moments. From its origins in the mid-90s to its rise as the stage for gaming's biggest announcements and its most recent struggles, E3's history reflects the evolution of the gaming world itself in many ways. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, who'd probably spend the entire expo in line for free swag. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, if you ever got to go to E3, would you go to all the big press conferences, or would you just kind of stand around playing the demos all day, you think?
More likely the demos, but, it's got to not be crowded, too, which, E3 it's going to be, so.
Was
I don't
it?
know.
Was
I
it?
don't know. I have no idea. I've never been.
Was it always crowded?
I guess we'll find out, won't we?
So, I know you probably haven't read this far ahead. I'm going to ask you right off the bat, what do you think was the biggest attendance number-wise? I'll tell you it's under 100,000. I'll give you that much. But how many people do you think attended the biggest year ever?
Somewhere between 68 and 70,000.
Okay. How many people do you think attended the lowest year ever?
Somewhere between 68 and 70.
Okay, we'll see if you're right. So today we're going to cover E3. I'm also going to cover the IDSA, which is the Independent Digital Gamers crap. I just butched that, but we're going to cover the IDSA, which is the trade organization that ended up putting on E3 every year because its history is very much the history of E3. So we're going to cover the IDSA. We're going to cover the ESRB as a result, and then we're going to cover E3. So a lot to go into today. But before we get to all that, how about you tell our listeners what else happened during this week in gaming history?
Sure thing. Kicking it off on May 12th, 1989, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was released for the Famicom in Japan, marking the home console debut of the beloved franchise. Developed by Konami and later published under its Ultra Games label in North America, the game featured a hybrid of top-down exploration and side-scrolling action as players guided all four turtles, Leonardo, Donatello, Michelangelo, and Raphael, through a mission to rescue April O'Neil and defeat the evil Shredder. Each turtle had unique strengths, encouraging tactical character swaps during gameplay. While it gained notoriety for its punishing difficulty, especially the infamous underwater dam level, it also became a commercial success, selling over 4 million copies worldwide and helping to solidify the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles' presence in video game history. On May 14th, 1998, Guilty Gear was released for the PlayStation in Japan, introducing a bold new contender to the 2D fighting game scene. Developed by Arc System Works under the leadership of Daisuke Ishiwatari, the game stood out for its anime-inspired visuals, heavy metal soundtrack, and high-speed combo-driven gameplay. Featuring a roster of 10 unique fighters, including series mainstay like Soul Bad Guy and Kai Kisk, Guilty Gear introduced innovative mechanics such as the tension gauge and instant kill moves, which could end a match in a single dramatic strike. Though unbalanced in places, the game's raw energy and distinctive style earned it a cult following and laid the foundation for one of the most enduring fighting franchises in gaming history.
Now, I was going to say if you've ever played Guilty Gear before.
I have never played Guilty Gear. Obviously, one of our former guests on the show, Colby, he's a big fan of the Guilty Gear series, so I've seen it played a lot. I've never played it myself.
Understandable. I've never even seen it, so you got a leg on me.
Oh, there you go.
Nice.
Next up, on May 16th, 2002, Final Fantasy XI was released in Japan for the PlayStation 2, marking the franchise's first foray into the massively multiplayer online role-playing game genre. Developed and published by Square, later Square Enix, the game introduced players to the expansive world of Vana'diel, where they could create customizable avatars, choose from various races and job classes, and embark on quests either solo or with other players. Notably, Final Fantasy XI was among the first MMORPGs to offer cross-platform play between PS2 and Windows PCs, fostering a unified player base. Despite initial challenges, such as the requirement of having a hard disk drive for the PS2 version, the game achieved significant success, leading to multiple expansions and a dedicated community that kept the game active for over a decade. Next up, on May 14, 2010, Alan Wake was released in Europe for the Xbox 360, introducing players to a psychological thriller that blended cinematic storytelling with intense action gameplay. Developed by Remedy Entertainment and published by Microsoft Game Studios, the game follows best-selling novelist Alan Wake as he searches for his missing wife in the eerie town of Bright Falls, Washington. Drawing inspiration from television series like Twin Peaks and the works of Stephen King, Alan Wake unfolds in an episodic format with cliffhangers and plot twists. The gameplay centers around a unique fight with light mechanic, requiring players to use light sources to weaken shadowy enemies before dispatching them with conventional weapons. The game received critical acclaim for its atmospheric setting, a compelling narrative, and innovative gameplay, earning a dedicated fanbase and spawning additional content, including 2 special episodes and a sequel released in 2023.
A great sequel. Actually, I'm a big Alan Wake fan. That's a fantastic series to begin with.
Haven't played it. Last up for this week in gaming history, on May 15, 2012, Diablo 3 was released for Windows and Mac OS, marking the long-awaited return of Blizzard Entertainment's iconic action role-playing series. Set 20 years after the events of Diablo 2, the game introduced 5 playable classes: Barbarian, Demon Hunter, Monk, Witch Doctor, and Wizard. Players embarked on a quest to save the world of Sanctuary from the forces of evil. Diablo 3 featured a revamped skill system, dynamic combat, and an always-online requirement which, while controversial, aimed to enhance security and multiplayer integration. Despite initial server issues at launch, the game achieved record-breaking sales, with over 3.5 million copies sold within the first 24 hours, making it the fastest-selling PC game of that time. The game's success led to the release of expansions like Reaper of Souls and Rise of the Necromancer, further solidifying its legacy in the ARPG genre. And with that, Dave, I think it's time for us to talk about our topic of the day.
Yes, indeed, Rob. So let's talk about E3. Actually, let's talk about where the gaming market was in the early 1990s, because that's kind of where this all starts today. You know, we've kind of talked a little bit about this before, early on in our podcast when we did an episode of Mortal Kombat. That was really before we were focused on the history and the stories from the like specific game standpoint, so we didn't go as much into this. But if you recall, because we talked about censorship, there was a time in which video game violence was a political issue, so to speak.
Right, very true.
And it very much is now, but we're talking congressional hearing political issue. Now, it kind of starts, realistically, the console wars is kind of where this all started. Like the beginning of the current like modern typical version of it. Because in 1990, as Nintendo was really preparing to release the Super Nintendo in the United States, they held 90% of the North American market share. Imagine that. 90% of all video games sold in the United States in 1990 were sold by Nintendo in some way, shape, or form. Now, in 1989, a year earlier, Sega had kind of just released the Sega Genesis. And like any company, when you launch a competitor, you are determined to make a dent in the market share, right? So they really began an aggressive marketing campaign, which I'd love to do a story on it for another time. It's basically the beginning of the console wars. And my favorite campaign that I remember from that time, the magazine print articles, they all said, they had all these features, games that were available on the Genesis, and in big writing it said, Genesis does what Nintendo don't.
Nice.
And I used to really like that. In some places where it wasn't the Genesis, because it was the Master System, it said Sega does what Nintendo don't. But they really started to aggressively pursue Nintendo's market share with these aggressive campaigns. And they were heavily promoting Sonic. And really, what's important to our story today is they became less selective about what games they would allow on their console. What they were hoping is that by allowing third party developers to make games for the Sega Genesis, they could have a larger library of games than what Nintendo has and make their console more appealing. And frankly, it worked. In 1992, Sega had 65% of the US gaming market. So think about that swing for a second. Think about how big of a dent they had to make to go from only having 10%, maybe not even 10%, to having 65%, right?
Right.
So Nintendo was no longer the top dog. And one of the consequences of that is that Sega Genesis releases were very much the focus, right? Because they were now the dominant gaming system around. And so Sega Genesis releases were what everyone wanted to talk about. And so we're in 1992, and two games get released, one for the Sega CD and one for the Sega Genesis proper. And that kind of all starts us down our path today. Those games were Night Trap and Mortal Kombat. Now, we're not going to talk much about Night Trap. That, again, deserves its own episode. But we have talked about Mortal Kombat, and it's important to today's story. It came out in 92. It was ported to consoles in September of 1993. And fall of 1993 was really a time when violence was becoming a more prominent conversation in the United States. 1993, like March or so, was the Oklahoma City bombing. Throughout the year, there were various shootings, mass shootings, not to the extent we have now, unfortunately, but there were mass shootings. I remember at one point, two CIA agents got gunned down by a Pakistani national in front of Langley. So gun violence was something that was being talked about, on a more regular basis. So violence in video games would follow suit. It was becoming an increasingly popular conversation amongst these conservative and family groups in the United States. And so, in recognition of this, the blood and gore that was found in the arcade version of Mortal Kombat was really pulled back from the console versions, right? But the Sega version happened to include something that Super Nintendo version did not, and that was a widely publicized cheat code that restored the game back to its full bloody gory glory. And what I mean by that is, in order to censor these games, they published them with green blood, so it wasn't seen as actual violence. But in the Sega version, there was a really simple cheat code that would turn it all back red, and then it became a problem again, funny enough. There was a congressional chief of staff his name was Bill Anderson, and he had been asked by his son to purchase the Sega Genesis version of Mortal Kombat. And Anderson took a look at the game, did some research, and he was really appalled by what he found, right? Because, let's be honest, there is a gratuitous amount of violence in Mortal Kombat, the likes of which had not been seen in any video game up until that point. And so Bill Anderson brings the game to his boss, who is Democratic Senator Joe Lieberman. And Joe is also shocked by the content within, and so he begins to gather information on what he called problematic video games, violent video games. So at the end of the year, December 1st, roughly, in 93, he declares his intention. He's going to hold a congressional hearing the following week to address the issue of violent video games, to focus on the fact that there is a lack of content ratings for video games. And his plan is to introduce a ratings body through legislation that's going to regulate the video game industry. Now, these congressional hearings were held on December 9th, 93, and March 4th, 1994. And they're their own story, realistically. We could spend a whole episode on the congressional hearings, and maybe we will someday. What basically happened is that Congress really they took the video game companies to task for their depictions of violence and basically said, hey, we're going to create a government agency to oversee content in your industry, among other things, if you don't find a way to do it yourself. And they followed up on this promise by introducing a bill that was called the Video Game Rating Acts of 1994 that did just that. It was going to establish a government agency that would basically create a rating system that was going to police the video game industry. Now, Lieberman, Joe, later admitted that the bill was really designed to coerce the industry into taking actions for themselves, that they really had no intention of following through on it, and his plan worked. So, in response to these congressional actions, there were a group of major developers and publishers that came together and they formed a trade group, a political trade group that was called the IDSA, or the Interactive Digital Software Association. They were formed in April of 1994, and their first order of business was creating a self regulatory framework for rating video games. And this is the rating system that we still use today, the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, or the ESRB, which they brought and presented to Congress on July 29th, 1994. Now, in that same interview, interestingly enough, Lieberman would state many years later, that the industry came up with a rating system that was better than they had planned on coming up with. And admittedly, he thinks it's better than what the movies have come up with all these years. So now we have the IDSA in place. There is an organization full of all the major players in the video game industry, and they now have political clout as a group, right? So ESRB is their first order of business, and their second order of business is actually our topic for today. With the background set, let's get at it. Up until this point, the video game industry piggybacked off the consumer electronics show and computer trade shows, like the European computer trade shows and CES, to showcase its products to retailers and the press, right? We know what CES is every year. They still have CES, right?
Sure.
Yes, they still have CES. Once upon a time, video games are part of that. According to Tom Kalinske, a CEO of Sega America back when, the CES organizers used to put the video game industry way, way in the back. In 1991, they put us in a tent, and you had to walk past all the porn vendors to find us. That particular year, it was pouring rain, and the rain leaned right on top of our new Genesis system. I was just furious with the way CES treated the video game industry, and I felt we were a more important industry than they were giving us credit for. And that was 91 was the last time that Sega went to CES. They didn't come back in 92, and because of the treatment, they were basically put on in temporary tents in the middle of a parking lot. Several other video game companies decided that they didn't want to participate in future CES shows, right?
Right. Now, my question as far as that, did the Genesis happen to survive the rain? Because that would have been pretty good selling point if it did.
Valid point. I don't know. Who knows if it was like a legitimate, like it could have just been a shell. You know how, I mean, video game companies
Oh,
have
that's
been
fair. Yeah.
doing that for years.
Right.
Initially, the video game executives did try to resolve this. They went to the organizers of CES in an attempt to resolve their issues. They didn't want to be put in temporary tents at the back of the show. But talks between the two parties got them nowhere, right? So it became obvious that CES wasn't going to properly recognize them as consumer electronics for whatever reason. Funny because of where we are now, though,
Mm-hmm.
because they've surpassed most of those other categories.
Most definitely.
At about the same time, the creator of GamePro magazine had an idea for a trade show that was built specifically for the video game industry. Now, the company that owned GamePro, which was IDG or the International Data Group, had its own exhibition management firm called the IDG World Expo. And that arm of the IDG already had a good track record. They were putting on successful trade shows like Macworld, which we've talked about in the past because there have been games that have been unveiled at Macworld, including Halo. The first time the world ever saw Halo was a Macworld Expo.
Hmm.
So the guy that owned GamePro, Paul Farrell, is calling around, or Pat Farrell rather, is calling around to drum up support in the video game industry, right? Just as the industry is coming together in response to the congressional hearings. This is just as they're forming the IDSA. So he goes to the IDSA and he proposes to them an alternative to CES, a video game industry specific trade show that he calls the Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3. At about the same time, CES finally relents. And basically, what they said is, they have more than one show a year, and they proposed the creation of a dedicated video game segment at their yearly show in Chicago. But Farrell was down this path. He saw a vision for E3. He wanted E3. And so he went all in on E3. He went all in and he picked the exact same dates as the Chicago show. And his hope was that he was going to force everyone to choose sides, right? Because you can't go to both.
That's always a good idea.
Sega, to their credit, immediately backed the new show. Nintendo, on the other hand, decided to err on the side of caution and they stuck with CES. So, for about the next 3 or 4 months, there was some back and forth between the companies. Nintendo and Microsoft both refused to back E3, the new show. Multiple meetings were had, debates were had, discussions followed, and eventually they caved and joined E3. And once Nintendo and Microsoft were in, Nintendo specifically is what everyone was waiting for because Microsoft was really just a software company at this time. Once Nintendo gave in and joined E3, that was what everyone was waiting for. Pretty much all the companies that were holding out at that point decided that they were on board. So now you have everyone on board, and we're there. The industry is finally ready to host their own trade event. Rob, it's kind of poetic that E3, the biggest stage in gaming, was born really out of rain leaking onto Sega's hardware in some ways, and then a trade show that parked the industry next to a tent full of adult content, right?
Right. All it took was some water damage, a few angry execs, and a whole lot of political pressure from Congress to finally give the video game industry its own spotlight.
Exactly. And whether you're launching a $1 billion console or just trying to share your own stories and ideas with the world, having the right platform makes all the difference. Which is why, if you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, Zencaster is the place to start.
All right, you've got my attention. What makes Zencaster the E3 of podcasting?
Well, Zencaster is an all in one podcasting platform that lets you record high quality audio and video straight from your web browser. There's no expensive gear, no complicated setups. Just plug in your mic, hit record, and go.
Sounds way easier than organizing an industry wide trade show in 6 months. But what about editing?
Well, that's the best part. Zencaster handles it for you. It automatically cleans up your audio, balances your sound levels, and even removes filler words like or It's like having your own behind the scenes production crew.
And once the show's ready, how do we get it out there?
Well, Zencaster makes distribution a breeze. You can publish directly to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all the major platforms without ever leaving the dashboard.
All right, I'm sold. How do our listeners get started?
Head over to zencaster.com/pricing and you can use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you'll get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan. Whether you're just getting started or already building an audience, Zencaster has the tools to make you sound like a pro.
So if you've got a message to share, or just want to avoid setting up shop next to a leaky tent, Zencaster is the platform for you.
That's right. Visit zencaster.com/pricing, use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and take center stage with your own podcast today.
And with that, let's get back to the show and see how the very first E3 forever changed gaming industry.
All right, so we have E3. The inaugural Electronic Entertainment Expo opens its doors on May 11th, 1995 at the LA Convention Center. Now, for the first E3, The International Data Group, IDG, actually held control of the E3 name and its intellectual rights. But after 40,000 people showed up the first year, the IDSA knew that they had struck gold. So they quickly renegotiated the contract, and they gained control over the E3 name, and they gained back control of the intellectual rights. And essentially, what happened is the IDSA would own E3, and they would hire the IDG World Expo as a management company to oversee the show. So they'd get their management fee, and then after the management fee and the cost of the show, the IDSA would pocket the net profits of the show. I would also like to add that this is a trade show. This is not a public show. You just couldn't walk up and get a ticket and walk in. You had to be a developer, an executive, a journalist. So you had to be a member of the industry. It wasn't a public show at this point. The first year, right out of the gate, E3 became the showcase for the console where we were just talking about, so to speak. Video game manufacturers were lining up, to one up one another and gain the industry's attention. At the very first E3, Sega shocked everyone by announcing that their upcoming console, the Sega Saturn, would be releasing immediately, like the day of the show, right this moment, and not in September like they had previously announced. Sony, not wanting to be outdone, announced the launch price of their upcoming console, which was the Sony PlayStation, and it came in at a full $100 cheaper at $299. It was $100 cheaper than everyone thought it was going to be. We were all expecting a $400 price point, so a $300 price point was the talk of the show, right?
Absolutely.
And then Nintendo announced the Virtual Boy.
Oof.
We all know how that one panned out.
Oh, yeah, we definitely do.
There were
And
other
if you
things.
don't, we've talked about it.
We have a whole episode on the Virtual Boy. There was some other fun stuff too there was a lot. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff for each show, and I'm not going to cover everything in each show. We're doing some highlights to the best of our ability. But also at this first show, Atari announced a pair of add-ons for the Atari Jaguar gaming console, the Jaguar CD add-on, and I didn't even remember this one, which is why I'm talking about it. There was a Jaguar VR add-on, which was a VR headset for the Jaguar console, which I didn't even know existed, to be honest with you. I don't remember it at all.
That's pretty cool.
Right? The following year, in 1996, E3 was held again at the LA Convention Center. This time, 57,000 people showed up. 1996 was the year of the price wars. Nintendo revealed the details for their upcoming console, the Nintendo 64, and they announced it at a launch price of $249. God, a system at $249 now would be a godsend, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh God, you'd sell so many. I mean, you sell a lot of systems at now $600 is what they all are. $249, they would be so much more accessible, and I think they would fly off the shelves even more. But that's just me being optimistic. Not wanting to be undone, Sony announced that their PlayStation would be dropping to $200, $199. In response to this, Sega dropped the Saturn to $199. And as a result, when the Nintendo 64 was finally released, it was also at the $199 price point.
Nice. Wow.
The organizers struggled to come to an agreement with the convention center for the following year of E3. So in 1997 and 1998, actually, the E3 was held in Atlanta, Georgia, at the Georgia World Congress Center. Now, 1997's lineup was full of what are now historically significant titles. Half-Life was shown there, GoldenEye, Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy VII, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and StarCraft.
That's pretty stacked loadout.
Absolutely nuts loadout. In 1998, E3 started to get a little bit extra. Sony hired the Foo Fighters to perform. Nintendo went and hired the B-52s because they felt it was nostalgic. They were kind of stuck in the
Hell of a plane.
98 was the year that Sega brought the Sega Dreamcast to the table. They basically said, hey, this is what we're making. Wasn't really unveiled till the following year, but we got our first wind of it at 98. Nintendo showcased the Ocarina of Time. Steam came to the table, the PC developer. They showcased a near finished version of Half Life. And the other talk of the show, a story that we know didn't end for quite a long while. We've done an episode on it. Have we done an episode on it? I don't think we have. Duke Nukem Forever was seen for the first time at E3 1998. I don't
We
think
did not do an episode on Forever. We did a 3D
we
Duke
did, but
Nukem,
I've
and we would have
never
mentioned Forever.
we did, but I've never covered Forever. You are correct.
Mm-hmm. Come on, Dave. You're supposed to remember everything.
I know, I know. It's been a day for me, as you know.
Yeah, true.
The show returned to the LA Convention Center in 1999, but the show was subdued that year because it was held less than a month after the Columbine High School massacre.
Oof.
So, violence in video games was a topic that permeated pretty much every press conference that was held that year. It was hard to not talk about it, because it was such a significant moment for us, in the United States. But there were some big announcements for the gaming community too that year. The Dreamcast, this is when we finally learned about its launch date, launch price. They loved this. It was given a launch date in the United States of 9/9/99, September 9th, 1999. And
Nice.
it would come out at a price of 199. So they loved their nines, their alliteration. Sony announced that they were working on their next PlayStation console. They didn't have it. I think they had like a PC set up that had emulator software that was showing what it could do. That would have been a PS2, but they didn't really give us more details other than that. Nintendo comes out swinging. They basically announce a new partnership with IBM and Panasonic and say, hey, in tandem with IBM and Panasonic, we're building a new console that would eventually become the GameCube, in case you don't know where we are. The showstopper for the next year, E3 2000, was the launch details for the PS2, which was going to come out in October of that year in the United States. It already come out in Japan, and basically, they brought it to E3 and said you'll get it in October. People were also excited for Metal Gear Solid 2. Metal Gear Solid 2 played on a large screen every hour on the hour outside of the Konami booth, basically.
Oh, wow.
So, do you remember E3? Like, was that a thing for you? I know not 2000 because you would have been so young, but eventually was E3 a thing for you?
I've never watched any of the things from it, or obviously I've never gone. I know about it. But that's
Why do you think that is? Did game announcements not interest you?
not all that much. I mean, if like you're usually the one who tells me about the things, so
True.
you spend a lot more time looking into that stuff, and if there's something that interests me, I'll find out about it eventually, right?
You mean I do watch the things and then get excited about them and tell you all the stuff I'm excited for?
Not just you. I mean, I have a few friends, like a few people we've had on the podcast, even who like Nintendo Direct and everything. Same thing. They'll watch them and they'll fill me in at the back end. So
Gotcha. Also, I tell you the things you're going to be excited for.
yeah,
The E3 2001, which is where we are, was the year of the GameCube official announcement. So the year before, they said, hey, we got a partnership with these companies. We're working on something new. In 2001, they unveiled that it was Project Dolphin at that point. In 2001, they officially announced the Nintendo GameCube. 2001 was when Microsoft also unveiled the Xbox. If I remember correctly, they brought out Dwayne the Rock Johnson to introduce the Xbox. If I remember correctly,
interesting choice.
people were still talking about Metal Gear Solid 2, which is probably why they missed an announcement for a little company called Rockstar and a game that they were making called Grand Theft Auto 3 at the time.
Never heard of it.
I know, right? Let me tell you, at the time, no one heard about it either because no one really gave it press coverage after that. It was a little footnote. It was a little footnote after E3 2001.
Wild to think.
I know it's fun to see some of this where you're like, huh. In 2002, The show was dominated by the announcement of Doom 3, the third game in the Doom series by id Software. There were other games too. Metroid Prime was on the floor. Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball was on the floor.
Very nice.
Battlefield 1942 was on the floor. Little
Hell
game.
yeah.
I mean, no one had heard of it at that point. But that was not what people talked about. People were talking about Doom 3. The demo for Doom 3 was a generational leap in graphics that nobody was expecting, no one saw, and we were all floored by it. We were absolutely floored by it. Doom 3 was one of those moments where graphics took a leap. Uh, it was amazing. I remember. So I was so excited when that game was coming out. Now, just like people wanted to talk about Doom 3 after the 2002 show, people were talking about Half-Life 2 after E3 in 2003. The Not as much the graphics for Half-Life 3, but the physics engine, which is what Half-Life 2 added to Half-Life. I mean, they upgraded the graphics too, but I think that was when Nvidia was starting to come out with their physics technology. Ooh, don't hold me to that. I'm probably way off on my timelines. But anyways, um, Half-Life 2 was the topic of conversation in 2003. There were other games, of course. Halo 2 was announced that year, Gran Turismo 4, Spider-Man 2, and the Ninja Gaiden reboot. But, you know, Doom 3, Doom 3 was it, man. I mean, Half-Life 2 was it, man. I mean, no, I'm just kidding. Every year it's something new, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's how it goes. The next big thing. Same with cars, same with movies.
I know.
That's life. We just wait for the next big thing.
In 2004, E3 was dominated by handheld consoles. Sony brought their PlayStation Portable. Nintendo announced the Nintendo DS. Many of the games that we were looking forward to from the previous year, Halo, Gran Turismo, Spider-Man, all those, they really hadn't been released yet. So aside from the handhelds, it was very much a year of follow-up. 2005, fantastic year of E3, great year for gamers. The Xbox 360, the PlayStation 3, and the Wii were all announced at that show.
Wow,
So
that's a
we
lineup.
we got that whole generation of consoles announced at E3 in 2005. There were a lot of notable games there too. Alan Wake, Battlefield 2, Call of Duty 2, The Witcher, Hitman, Blood Money, and Lord of the Rings Online. We get it that year. Rob, to your question, you were pretty much right on the money when I asked you to give me the total number. In 2005, that was the year that E3 would get its highest attendance, and that attendance was literally 70,000 people. Actually, it was 69 and some change. So when you said between 68 and 70, you were right on the head.
Damn straight I was.
Did you look it up ahead of time?
I did not.
Oh, good. All
I
right.
just went for the meme.
Fair enough. Then the meme was right on. It might have been 68.5, but I literally know you were right in the middle of where it needed to be. So
It's all that matters.
the following year, 2006, the Wii took center stage. That was the talk of the town for 2006. Sony basically talked up the graphics in their games, showing off things like, I think, uh, Motorstorm. Trying to think of what else came out that year. It doesn't matter. Microsoft was pushing their first person third party games, BioShock, Mass Effect, Gears of War, Assassin's Creed. They were basically saying, hey, we're the destination platform for all of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And while it didn't match the last year's attendance of 70,000, 2006 saw 60,000 people. And so E3 has grown beyond anything the trade industry had originally imagined, right? It was larger and it was more expensive than anyone had even thought of when this was originally a thing, right? And so there was a backlash because the show had gotten huge and had gotten really expensive. These companies were putting on these elaborate booths that were literally like hundreds of thousands of square feet of space, and it was costing so much money. So there's a backlash, and as a result, trade show organizers decide that they're going to downsize the show. And so E3 for 2007 was moved out of the convention center to various locations across downtown Santa Monica. This show was renamed the E3 Media and Business Summit, and participation from the public, which was already limited, was even more severely limited. As a result, only 10,000 people visited E3 in 2007.
Wow. Quite a drop.
Quite a drop. That year pretty much saw games like BioShock, Fallout 3, Resident Evil 5, Crisis, and Rock Band. It wasn't in one place. They held events at various hotels in downtown Santa Monica. They held an event at the airport. The journalists were having to go from point A to point B to point C. It's kind of like the format is now, though, where this conference was here, this conference was there, but it was just a lot of different events at Santa Monica, and it was a disaster from what I understand. It low attendance, people didn't like it, so that format short lived. In 2008, E3 moved back to the convention center. The industry did not want to go back to the large show, so they agreed on a smaller show. Instead of taking up the entire convention center, they only took up one wing of the convention center, a single room, if you will. Um, Microsoft brought to that show Gears of War 2, Fable 2, Banjo Kazooie, Halo Wars came in 2008. Nintendo announced its Wii Motion Plus controller. If you'll recall, that was alongside Wii Music and Wii Sports Resort. Also, I think that was the year Animal Crossing. There was a new Animal Crossing title. What would it have been in 2006? The folk one? Um,
Yeah, I honestly never played until New Horizon.
I gotcha. So, new Animal Crossing came out that year. Sony announces Killzone 2, God of War 3. So, things are going. Here's where you were wrong, Rob. That year, 2008, because of the damage of the previous year, only 5,000 people attended E3 that year.
Damn.
The
A little
smallest
more than
attendance.
69.
Its smallest attendance out of its entire history.
Yeah, it's pretty small comparatively.
So, 2009, things go back to normal. 5,000 people is not okay, so they say, okay, we're going to go back to the original format. Everyone was ready for it. They want to go back to the pomp and circumstance. They want the big announcements. They want the pizzazz of the original format. Microsoft talks about their new motion controller, which was Project Natal at the time. They showcase Modern Warfare 2, which was a game changer for multiplayer gameplay. They talk about Alan Wake. Halo 3 ODST and Halo Reach were announced. Sony gives us Uncharted 2, more God of War 3 demos. Nintendo gives us lots of good stuff. New Super Mario Brothers, I think, was their highlight that show. So it was a good show. We were back, baby.
Indeed. Then what?
2010 was a year of the motion control. Microsoft gave us the Kinect, Sony gave us the Move, and Nintendo talked up the Wii in competition. Then they brought out like hundreds of Nintendo 3DSs and put them in people's hands, which became like the talk of the show.
Wow. That would have been cool.
2011, Nintendo unveils the Wii U. Sony showcases the Vita, their handheld replacement for the PSP. Microsoft shows off Halo 4. 2012, chock full of great games: Borderlands 2, Dishonored, Resident Evil 6, Tomb Raider, Assassin's Creed. We saw The Last of Us for the first time. That's what everyone wanted to talk about afterwards. In 2013, Xbox One and PlayStation 4 were announced. Games like Batman Arkham Origins, Battlefield 4, Dark Souls 2, Diablo 3, Halo 5, Kingdom Hearts 3, Mario Kart 8, Star Wars Battlefront, The Last of Us came up again, and Titanfall. And if you can't tell, the list just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger than anything I've pretty much talked about before. And that list isn't even the tip of what was found at the show. We're talking hundreds of games at this point. At this point, attendance has settled into about 50,000 people. And so the show becomes the highlight for the entire industry. It grows each year, which, to be fair, makes these lists as we go on in this story more impossible. So I'm going to kind of narrow it down to what was most talked about, specifically one thing for the following years. 2014, Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Good year, right?
Mm-hmm.
2015, Sony basically makes us all lose our minds when they say, yeah, we are working on a Final Fantasy VII remake. 2016, Hideo Kojima is back, baby! Surprises the world with Death Stranding. 2017, E3 is open to the general public for the first time. They never sold public tickets before 2017. In 2017, there are 15,000 public passes sold. So just so you know. Nothing stood out in 2017, but there was a huge list of games that were found at the show, including Fortnite, which, as we know now, one of the most financially successful games of all time. I'm not going to say it's the most successful, but it's definitely the most financially successful, I think, at this point. E3 2018, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate.
Nice. Very good.
2019, Keanu Reeves announces Cyberpunk 2077.
Mm.
And then we get to 2020, right? The pandemic.
Yeah, womp womp.
The pandemic hits. E3 is canceled. But let's be honest about E3 at this point. Let's talk about what it became. Let's talk about, Rob, why you probably never made E3 a thing. Because I think that this is important. I think your generation, what you said, is very much why we are where we are now. As the years progressed, E3 became less about the big announcements and more about journalists and then the public, obviously, learning more about game announcements that were made online. Because as the internet gained popularity, it became people's primary news source, right? So
Right.
instead of delivering information with these big, expensive booths and conferences where you got to pay The Rock to come and show your stuff, I mean, there was other years that there were ridiculous stunts like that. You can just you can just announce it online, right? And instead of only getting to the industry, you can get it to everyone. So suddenly everyone gets to see what's going on. Everyone gets to form their opinion. Everyone gets excited alongside the journalists who then write about it and then help people form an opinion. So now you're reaching millions of people at once, realistically, millions of people instead of just thousands at a 1, 2, or 3 day event, right?
Right.
And so the internet, in a lot of ways, really took over for it really took over for events like this, for E3, for CES in some ways. Like it was no longer the primary way that people were getting information because it wasn't the most economically viable way to do it. You could impact more for less with the internet, which we all know is the case for everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the industry was in a really good place for 2020 because they didn't need E3 anymore. So E3 2021 comes around and they announce it as an online only event because COVID's still a concern. And so instead of being the Electronic Entertainment Expo, it goes online as the Electronic Entertainment Experience. And it does well. But again, why? Why when Nintendo can do a direct in the middle of May, do they have to wait for E3 to do it? Like it just doesn't make any sense anymore, you know?
No, it doesn't.
There were plans to bring it back as an in-person event in 2022, but when it came time to make that decision, the Omicron variant of COVID was on the rise, so it was canceled. And at that point, because they were bringing it back in person, there were no plans for an online event like the Electronic Entertainment Experience, so it just fell to the wayside. People did their own thing. And so when it came time to look at 2023, because of their experience from 2020 on, where they were successfully doing it without E3, there just wasn't any interest from anyone in the industry to continue. So in 2023, the IDSA came forward and said, hey, look, it's been a good run, 25, 26 years, depending on how you look at it. You know, with some, 26 of them, I think there was. But there's no need. There's no one wants to participate anymore. So E3 is now a thing of the past. And here we are. I I don't disagree with where we're at. I think E3 gave us a lot of really fun things to talk about. You know, I mean, we could do entire episodes on one E3 in itself, right? A single day and hundreds of titles. We could do it literally an E3 episode for each year. Um, it gave us a lot of great things to talk about, but as I said, I think the internet is just a much more viable delivery medium for these announcements than E3 is nowadays because it's just going to end up on the internet anyways. You're just taking another step, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Um,
true.
I like I like where we're at now. I like where we're at now. I like Nintendo Directs. I like Sony's conferences, to Microsoft's. I like the way we do it now. I like that I can get the information directly, the trailers directly, and I can form my own opinion. Now I will still go online to see what journalists think to engage and be part of that conversation, but I don't need them to tell me. I don't need them to tell me anymore. Like I can form my own opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So I regret never getting to go to E3. I think being in that environment was fun. I think there's still a place for things like that. Maybe not one that's entirely funded by the industry. Maybe one like it's almost like uh, I guess cons have kind of replaced it, like video game cons, right? Where we go and we celebrate the culture and everything, and not just make these big announcements. But I think there's a place for that. PAX is an example, but really, I kind of I don't think E3 is going to be missed.
Not by many.
Well, you didn't really you don't miss something you didn't watch in the first place.
Yeah, exactly.
And that from its early beginnings and congressional hearings to E3 is E3. That's the history of E3, a little bit of each year and how it came formed and everything. That at one point it was gaming's premier event and now it's no more. Want want.
Wompity womp womp.
All right, Rob. Well, there were a lot of fantastic announcements at E3, and we've covered a lot of games that were first unveiled at E3. And we talk about E3 in those episodes. The first time this game was seen for the world was at E3 this year and this year. Um, you know, Legend of Zeldas and Half Lifes and Borderlands and Battlefield and lots of games we've talked about in the past. And of course, if you want to learn any of their stories, you can do so by going to our website, which is www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people do on our website?
You can find a calendar of our future episode topics. You can find links to our Discord where you can come chat with Dave and I about episode topics or video games in general. Links to our Patreon where you can help support us and get access to ad-free and unedited versions of our episodes. And links to our social media where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is wrong. Each week, ladies and gents, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It could be about a game, a console, a person. We've done it on museums before. We're going to do it on a specific arcade in the future, soon. The U.S. National Video Game Team and Twin Galaxies of this year. So we pick one topic, find a way to make it relevant to the publication week of this podcast, and we roll with it. We'll tell you each story. We hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Every week when I sit down to write a new episode, I learn things. That's my favorite thing. I get excited to learn new things because when I learn new things, I get to teach new things. And it's this fantastic cycle of teaching and learning, learning and teaching. And in celebration and recognition of the cycle, we like to talk about what we've taken away every episode. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, obviously, having never watched E3 or just gone, not really only could rather for those last few years of it. I think it's just kind of crazy that it came because of just poor representation at CES and a console getting rained on.
Yeah, think about how big E3 got and how it's a profitable. It has to be a profitable show for the IDSA at some point, right? Uh,
Yeah.
and CES dropped the ball on that because they could have been the ones profiting from the how big the video game industry got. And to be fair, the video game industry does have representation at CES now. Not never to the extent of E3. It will never be a video game it will never be a video game expo. It was more like here's our console, here's some cool accessories for our console, here's how your TV works with our console, like things like that. But they could have had it made personally. That's a missed opportunity there.
No, it definitely is. But, that's sometimes that's just the way the cookie crumbles. So that's
That's
my big takeaway. What about yourself?
I never knew about the years that E3 got so small. I never 2007, 2008 when it was in Santa Monica and then the 5,000, at the LA Convention Center. I
Hmm.
don't I know that I looked forward to it every year. I know I watched it every year like when I could or read about it. it was a thing for me. I know once we got into 2010s, like the year of the 360 PlayStation 3 Wii announcement, I took the day off work to watch those conferences actually.
Oh wow.
So it was an event for me personally. But I never knew it had gotten so like there was a backlash that had gotten so small. Like that's not something I think would be talked about that much, but whatever. So that was kind of fun to learn, the years it was in Atlanta and the years that it was there. I enjoyed getting to learn all about that for sure.
Right on. Pretty cool.
Indeed, pretty cool indeed. All right, Rob. Well, before I wrap up this week and look at next week, is there anything that you'd like to add to today's episode?
I'll just take a quick moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. It means the world to us to have you along as we learn about all of our different video game topics, conventions, accessories, whatever may be the topic of the week. So we hope you enjoy, and we appreciate you joining us as we are learning.
Yes, indeed. As we step off the bustling floor of E3, we're reminded of how this iconic event shaped the gaming world by bringing groundbreaking announcements and unforgettable moments to life. For decades, E3 was the heartbeat of the industry, defining its direction year after year. So, whether reminiscing about legendary reveals or anticipating the future, never forget the excitement of gaming's biggest stage. Next week, though, we're trading the spectacle of E3 for the shadowy corridors of Perfect Dark. Released in 2000, this spiritual successor to GoldenEye 007 thrusts players into a futuristic world of conspiracy, espionage, and alien intrigue. With its cutting edge mechanics and legendary multiplayer, Perfect Dark wasn't just a shooter, it was a masterclass in innovation. So join us as we uncover the secrets behind this genre defining classics as we take next week's stealthy trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.